I've heard, so my first son, at the end, there was no fluid. I don't know anything beyond all those that in stuff. I have no idea. Obviously, I was not monitored. But when I had my rainbow, when we started getting monitored, it was like 20 some weeks or whatever with our specialist. We noticed that I had a little bit more fluid. I was still in normal range and I stayed in normal range the rest of my pregnancy, but I always kind of like was slowly increasing. And he always like, oh, and he told me possibility you might go into labor early.
Because of volume. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a lot. He's like, there's a lot in there. And then I heard later on, I never even knew about it, never heard anything. Cause I don't even know if this is even real, but with a baby having a little bit more fluid, could there be anything later on after they're born, whether they're born vaginally or C-section? Could there be anything of some type of issues with maybe something not developing properly or something, maybe them struggling to meet milestones or anything like that that has to do with maybe kind of has to do with the fluid, or I don't know, maybe it could be the way that they're born, but it's something kind of like that. I know that sounds weird, but I kind of heard this, that somebody was saying something and I was like, well, I know when you're over, you have too much fluid, there is things going on. Like when you reach a certain point.
When there's too much amniotic fluid, we worry that a baby's esophagus is somehow constricted because, babies swallow a lot of their own amniotic fluid and then they regurgitate it out. So if they're not able to swallow it and it's all just being regurgitated, then that's one reason why you could have too much fluid. But that's an easy check once the baby's out. They can look down there and make sure there's no restriction or constriction. But I haven't heard about polyhydramnios, like mild polyhydramnios, being associated with, poor developmental milestones or anything like that.
No, okay. When I had my second son and I had serious poly, I forget what week it hit, but it was early on, second trimester sometime, I think. And they booked me for a same day full anatomical ultrasound. And they scrutinized every single thing they could see. They counted his fingers, his toes, his kidneys, his brain, his heart. I think they checked out anything that they could see on the ultrasound. They checked it out. They measured it. They logged it. So if it's serious poly, they'll look for problems with the baby, because that's where, if there's a reason, they'll find it there. But other than that, I don't know. I think it's also a feature of diabetes too sometimes.
Yeah, you often think that even if you haven't caught a gestational diabetic, they're diabetic if you see polyhydramnios, because something about the high sugar content of the fluid makes a high sugar content of the baby's fluid too, which by osmosis, keeps more fluid in. So if I see a big baby with a lot of fluid and somebody tells me, nope, I've passed my diabetes screen, I'm like, sorry, you're diabetic. Because, you have to go by what you're seeing. You have how many people say, I had a huge healthy baby, 10 pounds. That ain't no healthy baby. It's nice that they're 10 pounds and they look so chubby and everything, but that is a baby that will have hypoglycemia at the delivery or later on have insulin, resistance problems, because 10 pounds is not an average or normal size baby. It's too big.
Okay, so some women, not me, after they give birth, they retain fluid, they are told sometimes. It's because of all that IV fluid that you had. Well, I had all that IV fluid. I did not swell up like the Michelin Man. So I suspect it's not really the IV fluid, and it's probably, unfortunately, hormones. So which hormones and why?
It actually is very diet related too, because one of the things that you can test when someone's admitted for labor or even before they go in for labor is you can test their blood for an albumin level or a protein level, two different things. And I'm always shocked to see people that I thought would have high protein levels in their blood have very low albumin and protein levels. And what that does is when you have very low levels, it means that your protein in your blood is not high enough. And when you have low protein, you tend to retain fluid. because the fluid goes into spaces that it normally shouldn't go. And you see when people are swollen, it's like right under the skin. We call it third spacing sometimes, or subcutaneous swelling. The better your protein levels in your body, the less that will happen. So people who have hypertension or other vascular disease or diabetes, they tend to have lower protein levels and albumin levels in their blood and retain more fluid. It is true, though, if you give somebody liters and liters and liters of IV fluid during their labor and they're not urinating it out, it is going somewhere, but often people who are in labor are dehydrated. So that fluid is actually replenishing what they need that they weren't having. Because I'm very often shocked that someone's in labor, they have an epidural, which means they have a catheter in their bladder. So you can see what the color and the quality of their urine looks like. They've gotten 4 liters, that's 4,000 cc's of IV fluid, and their urine is still dark yellow or amber colored. That means they haven't gotten enough. Because if you have enough fluid in your system, your kidneys should be working to urinate out just the fluid portion of it. And this thing that makes it dark should stay in your body, your nutrients, But if you're dehydrated, that's a measure of dehydration, how dark your urine is. But I feel like in the labor, they very much underhydrate people.
That's weird. I would think you'd want your patients to be well hydrated during it.
They are, though, because the fluid's running, and in order to get an epidural, you have to have at least a liter of fluid. But then I'm at the bottom part of the bed looking at this Foley and going, do you see how dark that urine is? Give her more fluid. And unless she's like a hypertensive or really has vascular disease, these are mostly young and healthy, quote unquote, people. They're not like old people with, congestive heart failure. So the fluid should go to where it needs to go. And then the part you don't need, you should urinate it out, and it should be clear or light yellow, and that's it.
Okay, that makes sense. It's just that I can't believe that people are so you're undergoing a physical
marathon.
It's just very stressful physically and emotionally. And it's like, well, wouldn't you want to be like completely well hydrated during that? Of course you can't.
Also, I did a C-section, right? That means that the person hadn't eaten or drank anything from 12 hours before, because you have to be NPO to do the section. And then they give them 2 liters of fluid before I start. And then they bleed like any C-section would bleed. And there's a catheter in there. At the end of my C-section, there's maybe 50 cc's in the catheter. And I have to start thinking, did I damage the bladder during the C-section that the fluid that's not coming out? I mean, you have to start thinking, what is the reason there's no fluid there? And I tell the anesthesiologist, just open up that bag. And like an hour later, boom, it all comes out. So, they like readjust their system because, they got spinal anesthetic that vasodilates all their blood vessels. So more fluid, goes into the tissues. So it's a whole balancing act. And thank God, most women come out of it in pretty good balance. But that's why after a C-section, after a delivery, you have to be right on top of that. How much fluid is going in? How much fluid's going out? If it's really out of balance, you got to figure out why.
Some of the UK stuff that I hear is just like, I want to go bang my head against somebody's wall, where they have patients who aren't urinating for a day. And then it turns out they're really sick. And I'm like,
they're internally bleeding,
that kind of thing. And I'm like, how do you not notice? Do you guys not do do you guys not do a hemoglobin after they give birth and before you discharge them? Just a quick stick. Check, make sure that their hemoglobin hasn't tanked out on them for some reason.
Well, what the problem is now in a lot of places, especially Kaiser, there's a 24-hour discharge. You had vaginal delivery yesterday at 11, by 11 today, you're out of there. That's not even enough time to know if something's wrong, right? You'll end up back in the emergency room. And who can breastfeed after 24 hours? Nobody knows how. It's a crazy system.
Do they bring their patients back in?
Yeah, but you know what? Go travel with a newborn when you don't really get near the hospital. Go put him in that car seat contraption that you've never used before 2 days after you just gave birth and you can't even sit down.